The content you're about to hear may be graphic in nature. Listener discretion is advised. This is True Crime XS.
So if I've timed all this correctly, then what we have going tonight is it's an older case and it's Christmas Eve. I picked a weird one from this because of, I don't know, wanting to tell kind of a special story. This is one of those that, like, there are a couple of sources out there. They're kind of strange. The Villager had an article on him that I pulled. There's this episode, Billy Bragg talking about thanks for giving a damn with Otis Gibbs. I pulled a couple of New York Times articles. When I read about this, I wasn't 100% sure I would be able to find enough sources that were like kind of accurate about what had happened with him. But I will say that like a lot of material in modern music today is kind of attributed here. Some of what I'm telling you is not going to be facts. Some of this is like a collection of sort of statements that have been made in the media over time. And this is about just this one guy. I just thought his case was interesting. And I thought, the questions at the end are really interesting, particularly with how it shook out. So the story that we're telling you today is about a guy that was born October 7th of 1879. His name was Joel Emanuel Hagelin. He was also known for a period of time as Joseph Hillstrom. He was a labor activist. He was a songwriter. He was a member of the Wobblies, which is the Industrial Workers of the World. We'll talk a little bit about them here in a minute. When he was born in Gästrikland, Sweden. He was one of 9 children. The family had lost a couple of kids who died very young. His father was a man named Olof, who worked as a conductor on a railway in Sweden. His dad died young. He died when he was 41 years old. His dad dying basically doomed their family. Now, his mom, Margareta, she kept everything together as much as she could, but she wasn't able to succeed necessarily financially. Their home, their family home, it still stands at the same address that it's always been there. I think that it still has a museum in it. I don't know that for sure. I do know that there's a garden and like a little event space there. Joe, he ended up falling pretty seriously ill when he was young. He underwent extensive treatments, and in October of 1902, he was around 23 years old when he and his brother Paul left Sweden and they came to the United States. He moved around doing different types of day labor work. First, he was in New York City. Then he moved to Cleveland, Ohio. And he would make his way to San Francisco because we know he was there at the time of the 1906 earthquake in San Francisco. He began to use the name Joe Hill when he joined the Wobblies around 1910 or so. He was working on the docks and in the loading areas in San Pedro, California. In late 1910, he wrote a letter to the Industrial Worker, which was the IWW's newspaper. He identified himself as a member of the local chapter out of Portland, Oregon. He moved up in the ranks of the Wobblies. He traveled pretty widely. And he would organize workers under the IWW banner. He would write satirical poems. He was making speeches. He was very much an orator. This was a time when, like, a lot of people in power, for good or bad, they could use their ability to speak in public and to put together good words to rise to interesting positions. We've seen it in World War I, World War II. He would write political songs. So he and Harry McClintock were spellbinders for the WWW. People may know Harry McClintock for the Big Rock Candy Mountain song. They showed up in June of 1913 for the Tucker, Utah strike. And that is one of the more interesting things that we're going to talk about today. The Tucker, Utah strike was a 1913 strike action against the Utah Construction Company's railroad track laying operation. He's mentioned in multiple books that talk about the union movements in Utah. At this time, he had fully shortened his name to Joe Hill and was only going by Joe Hill. This is how he wrote his songs. He would draw cartoons related to the work that he was doing. And this is all his other writings from this time would appear under the name Joe Hill. He is credited with having coined the phrase pie in the sky, which I don't know if a lot of people use that phrase anymore, but pie in the sky is from his song, The Preacher and the Slave. The lines that he used said, "You'll get pie in the sky when you die." And the idea was a fanciful notion or this like ludicrous concept where you're promised something that is probably not going to happen. He has a list of other songs that you can find online. As he's moving around and going job to job, he is bouncing on and off of freight trains. And by the end of 1913, he was working as a day laborer at the Silver King mine in Park City, Utah, which is not all that far from Salt Lake City. And on January 10th of 1914, John Morrison and his son Arling, they were killed in the Salt Lake City grocery store that they owned by two armed intruders who were masked with red bandanas. They were using them like balaclavas, kind of an Old West image, like I think of the bad guys in cowboy movies dressing like that. The police first thought that this was some act of revenge. Nothing was stolen. And John Morrison, who was the dad, he had been a police officer, and they believed it was possible he had created quite a few enemies in his time as a police officer. The same evening that they're shot in their grocery store, Joe Hill shows up on the doorstep of a local doctor, and he has a bullet wound that's pretty serious. It's through his chest, and it's gone through his left lung. According to Joe Hill, he said that he had been shot in an argument over a woman. He didn't name the woman. He didn't name who shot him at the time. The doctor reported that Joe Hill was armed. He had a pistol on him. So 12 people are arrested in this case, not Joe Hill to start. This was men that were rounded up when they went and basically rounded up the usual suspects. This was related to John Morrison's past as a police officer. These were people he would have run into. Ultimately, the 13th person to be arrested in this case is Joe Hill, and he's arrested and he's charged with their murder. They find a red bandana in Joe Hill's rented room, and the pistol that the doctor said he had seen Joe Hill carrying is not found. Joe Hill says that he was not involved in the robbery and killing of John and Arling Morrison. He said that he was shot, his hands were over his head, and the bullet hole in his coat, which was 4 inches below the exit wound in his back, seemed to support this claim. So the trial comes up. Joe does not testify at his trial. His lawyers point out that 4 other people were treated that very same night for bullet wounds around Salt Lake City. They also point out that the lack of robbery and Hill being completely unknown to Morrison pretty much left him with no motive. So the prosecution brings in quite a few witnesses, including about 12 people who said that the person that went in and out of the grocery resembled Joe Hill. They have a 13-year-old named Merlin Morrison who he is John's son, and he is Arling's brother. According to what had been said was when the police first asked him about Joe Hill, he said that's not him at all. But later on, when it gets to trial, he does identify Joe Hill as being the person who had killed his father and his brother. Had you ever heard of this case before? It's a weird one that I picked here.
Yeah, no, I've never heard of it.
The jury takes about 4 hours to deliberate and find Joe Hill guilty of these murders. He appeals. There's a man named Orrin Hilton. He represents Joe Hill in one round of his appeals, and he declares the main thing that the state had on Joe Hill was that he was a member of the IWW. And as far as anyone would ever be concerned about Joe Hill, he was going to be guilty. Now, Hill had tried to keep his membership with the Wobblies out of the trial, but ultimately, the media at the time didn't have much else to do in this area, so they kept mentioning that he was a member of the IWW. He gets all the way to the Utah Supreme Court, and his appeal is unsuccessful. In a letter to the court, Hill continued to deny that the state had a right to inquire into the origins of his wound just because it's a bullet wound. So different judges looking at that at the appellate level and then all the way up to the Supreme Court, they took that to basically mean he was probably guilty of something. In fact, Chief Justice Daniel Straub, he wrote up that this unexplained wound was a distinguishing mark and that the defendant may not avoid natural and reasonable inferences of remaining silent, which is kind of a big deal, as the defendant's right to not incriminate themselves or to remain silent have been well established after this.
Right, but it's not necessarily saying, well, it's kind of hard to say because I feel like the justice was saying, like, yes, I don't know if the presumption of innocence was there, but he's saying that there are going to be reasonable inferences, right? Which actually flies directly in the face of how we perceive a defendant remaining silent today, in my opinion.
We're protected by Miranda today, and we are also protected by the Fifth Amendment. But neither of those would really work in Joe Hill's favor for post-conviction relief.
His argument was that the state didn't have the right to inquire into the origins of his bullet wound, right?
Yeah.
But even today, if you get shot and go to a hospital, it will be reported.
It will. And so, do you know why that is, by the way?
Well, just to have a record of it.
And so it falls under mandatory reporting. Have you ever delved into this part?
I doubt it.
Okay. We're going a little off topic for a minute, but I think this is an interesting way to go. You go hunting to figure out why this requirement exists. It's a statute that most states have, 48 states have mandatory reporting statutes. So that's going to be all but 2. The statute lays out a mandate that healthcare providers have to report knowledge and or treatment of bullet wounds. And that's regardless of the timeline or age of the injury. Violations of this mean that depending on the state, the person who doesn't report can get a fine or go to jail. And also the timeline for when they have to report it varies. And the subsequent legal actions can vary. This is something that has come about because in the United States, we have a lot of bullet wounds. And I looked for a deeper origin for this, if that makes sense. Like, where did this come from?
I feel like it's partially to maintain the seriousness of bullet wounds, of gunshot wounds.
So Joe Hill, while he's incarcerated, he writes an article for a socialist newspaper that was known at the time as Appeal to Reason. Socialism is an interesting construct into itself, but the Appeal to Reason kind of interested me, and I went down a little bit of a rabbit hole. It was a weekly left-wing political newspaper from 1895 until 1922. The whole concept of Appeal to Reason was to have an outlet for the Socialist Party of America to lend support to different minor parties, to, like, in history. The Farmers Alliance is in there, the People's Party in there. It's largely looked at as like a communist movement today. And the publication dies out in 1922. It ends up being terminated and replaced by a different weekly paper that sort of gets away from the whole idea of socialism, because the United States was not treating socialism, communism, general equality very well in the 1920s and the 1930s. So when he writes for this paper, Joe Hill says, owing to the prominence of this former police officer and grocer, Mr. Morrison, there had to be a goat. And the undersigned being, as they thought, a friendless tramp, a Swede, and worst of all, a wobbly, had no right to live anyway, was duly selected to be the goat. This case turns into a media debacle. You got the president chiming in, Swedish ambassadors chiming in, the Swedish public are chiming in. Helen Keller gets involved in this. Helen Keller is always an interesting figure to me. She's an author. She is an IWW member. She was blind and deaf. Because of the Swedish connection and because of the IWW connection, it is ultimately an international incident. Now, critics of this incident, they argue that this trial and Joe Hill's conviction are unfair. There are various petitions to the governor at the time, a guy named William Spry. But despite all of this, his guilt is maintained. His conviction is affirmed. Now, In a biography published in 2011, William Adler ends up talking about Joe Hill. He suggests that Joe Hill looked at himself as worth more to the labor movement as a martyr than he was alive. And that this understanding may have influenced his decisions, one, not to testify at the trial, and two, according to Adler, Joe Hill doesn't really participate in his chance at clemency or a pardon. There was an early suspect in this named Frank Wilson. So Frank Wilson is a pseudonym for a career criminal named Magnus Olsson. Have you ever heard of this guy before?
No.
Okay. So if you go find a rabbit hole for Magnus Olsson, he was born in Norway. He was the youngest of 5 kids. He was the suspect that was number 12. He had been arrested for these murders, but at the end of the day, they couldn't pin him down. So they let him go. Now, what's interesting about him is in the 1920s, Magnus Olsson, or Frank Wilson, depending on what you want to call him, he also went by James Morton, F.Z. Wheeler, James Farmer. He would go on to be a collector for Al Capone and his bodyguard. When the St. Valentine's Day Massacre occurs in Chicago in 1929 and 7 people are killed, guess who the car at the scene is registered to when the killers leave? Magnus Olsson. But I think, so there's a story, there's multiple stories in here. If you want to go down the rabbit hole for Joe Hill, the story that you want to read is Joe Hill, the Man Who Never Died, The Life and Times and Legacy of an American Labor Icon by William Adler. That's a good book. I think you can find it free online. There's also the New York Times article I mentioned at the beginning of all of this is called Examining a Labor Hero's Death. So Joe Hill has a different ending than most of the people that we've been talking about throughout this series. And because of that, his episode is a little shorter. On November 19th, 1915, so keep in mind, this murder took place January 1914. All these appeals have gone on. Joe Hill is at Utah's Sugar House Prison. He is executed by a firing squad. According to reports, Deputy Shetler, who was the leader of the firing squad, he called out a sequence of commands preparatory to firing: ready, aim, and Joe Hill apparently shouted, "Fire, go on and fire." That same day, at the Tarrytown estate of a man named John D. Archbold, who's a president of what's known as Standard Oil Company at the time, a dynamite bomb is discovered in his house. Police had a theory that Wobblies were going to blow up John Archbold's house as a protest against Joe Hill's execution. But the bomb ends up being found by a gardener. It's 4 big sticks of dynamite. They're about a pound each, and they're hidden in a rut in the driveway right outside the front entrance of the residence. They had been bound together by a length of wire. They were fitted with percussion caps, and they were wrapped with a piece of paper that would make them blend into the driveway. It's the same color. So this was the path that if Archbold's coming and going from his home, or if his car is sitting there or driving right by the front entrance, it's going to blow up. There's also an account that Joe Hill had written to one of the leaders of the Wobblies saying, "Goodbye, Bill. I die like a true blue rebel. Don't waste any time in mourning. Organize. And could you arrange to have my body hauled to the state line to be buried? I don't want to be found in Utah." Hunter S. Thompson has a different take on his last words. I'm not going to get into that whole deal. Hunter S. Thompson is his own creature. So Joe Hill's body is sent up to Chicago, and he's cremated in accordance with his wishes. His ashes are placed into 600 small envelopes, and they're sent around the world to be released to the winds of different cities. In 1916, delegates attend the 10th convention of the Wobblies in Chicago. They all get envelopes. It's 1 year to the day of Joe Hill's execution. The rest of the 600 envelopes are sent to locals, sympathizers, and union members. And they get theirs on January 3rd, 1917. Here's a weird thing that happened. In 1988, an envelope had been seized by the United States Post Office in 1917 because it had subversive potential. The envelope, it's got a photo affixed to it, is captioned, Joe Hill murdered by the Capitol class, November 19th, 1915. And its contents, they were deposited into the National Archives. A story appears later on in the United Auto Workers magazine, Solidarity. And then the New Yorker picks it up and they do a little article on it. So members of the Wobblies, the IWW in Chicago, they laid claim to the contents of the envelope. After some negotiations, the National Archive refuses to turn over the envelope, but when they realize it's Hill's ashes in 1988, they turn it over. There was an article in these times. They ran a notice of the ashes, and they actually had kind of a poll or like a write-in comment box to suggest like what should be done with them. Various things came about where Abby Hoffman suggested that they be eaten by today's Joe Hills, and he named a list of people. Allegedly, that kind of happened. And when they tried to track down what had happened, the majority of the ashes had been cast to the wind in U.S., Canada, Sweden, Australia, and Nicaragua.
Yeah, the ashes were weird. Don't eat people's ashes.
Have you read Adler's book?
No.
It's been a long time. According to what I read there, like they found the people. They found that a guy named Otto Appelquist had shot him and that they were fighting over.
Yeah, that's what they came forward and he was having a disagreement with his friend over the girl that was like the daughter of the house they were boarding at.
Yeah, they're in a boarding house, they're renting a room, and there's a girl there named Hilda Erickson. And so she's younger than Joe Hill, by the way. I think she's 19 or 20. He has a friend that's staying with him named Otto Appelquist. And the two of them had like a rivalry going on. And Hilda wrote a letter that talked about choosing between the two men. And it was discovered sometime in the 2000s that this letter indicates that she had found out that Joe Hill had been shot and that he had sent her a letter explaining to her that he and Otto had gotten into an argument and Otto had shot him because Otto believed that Joe Hill was going to win Hilda's affections. I thought it was interesting that this guy dies by firing squad. He's 36 years old when he dies over a teenage girl.
Right. And I feel like this is a case where he should have testified.
Yeah, he should have testified.
I feel like that was a completely plausible scenario because especially since, I don't know if you caught it or not, but they said the bullet hole in his jacket was 4 inches higher than the wound, which means his hands were up in the air, right?
Yeah.
Because when you raise your hands up, like fitted jackets go up. They don't stay where they're at, right?
Yeah.
And so when you put your hands back down, the hole's going to be higher. I don't believe in any of the conspiracy type stuff. I think they wanted to solve this crime, this double murder, and this was convenient. The fact that there were 4 other gunshot wounds in the area treated. I mean, it's possible that one of them was the perpetrator. It's also possible that they didn't get medical treatment. That I was going to say, how did they know the perpetrator had been shot?
My guess was that, okay, and I don't know this I haven't read this story in so long. I think it's because Morrison's gun had been destroyed in the robbery.
Okay, and so there was a huge presumption made there. Now, the other thing is that there were 2 armed intruders, right?
Correct. Who's the other guy?
Exactly. And so to me, this was a rush to judgment. This was a situation where he should have testified. And they drew conclusions that were too broad, in my opinion. But I can see where presented with this information and lacking a adequate defense, like, what actually happened. I would say that anytime the story has been said, like, oh, the perpetrator was shot and the defendant presented himself shortly after the crime for medical treatment for a gunshot wound.
Right.
That is automatically going to draw the attention and the presumption of innocence is going to be lost. right?
Right.
And I think that's what happened here. Now, so he died by death by firing squad, which is horrifying. Do you know why they do an entire squad?
So nobody knows who did it?
Right. Yeah. So then nobody knows who did it. Nobody knows which person's bullet kills the person. And I saw where the sheriff of Salt Lake City on November 22nd, 1915, he sends to the Honorable Board of County Commissioners of Salt Lake City County, Utah. Gentlemen, I beg leave to advise your honorable body that the accrued expenses in the case of the state of Utah versus Joseph Hillstrom amount to the sum of $317.80. These costs are in connection with the execution of the said Joseph Hillstrom. Will your honorable body please authorize the payment of this sum in accordance with the voucher, which I will, after authorization, send to the county auditor, the said voucher to be drawn in favor of John S. Corliss. Trusting your immediate attention, I remain yours respectfully, John
What?
S. Corliss. The sheriff sent a request for payment of the sum of $317.80 on November 22nd, 1915.
For the execution.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
I want to see what that converts to. Okay, so it's
3.21% or something like that. How much was it? 317 what?
$317.80.
So that conversion would be $9,921.06.
I guess.
Thereabouts.
So that's what
it costs to
request.
kill him.
That's what he says it cost, and he requests it be paid to him.
Well,
It's actually a really sad case. I don't think that he was responsible for it. We don't see any sort of indication that they tried to find who accompanied him. I really don't like it when evidence is sort of cherry picked in testimony, because, the testimony was there were two, right?
yeah.
Where's the other guy?
I wonder if it's Otto.
Well, I mean, it seems like under the circumstances, he could have very easily given Otto up. But I don't know. Like, I don't think it was him. Do you think he did it?
No, I don't think it was him. I don't even understand why he didn't testify, or like, if they hadn't found the letter, Adler's book would be kind of difficult to swallow. This is a weird case, not a lot of documents, but ultimately.
Well, he did tell the doctor that he was shot during a disagreement over a girl.
And that was before he would have known that
this was all going to happen.
Yeah.
And so to me, it lines up, especially since the girl who said it is the girl that was at what was her role? For some reason, I can't find this again.
She was the daughter of the lodging house. She was the daughter of the people who owned the lodging house.
So she was a member of the family with whom the two men were lodging. And so this girl had been playing, she was 20 years old.
Oh, okay.
She had been playing both of these men, and I shouldn't say it that way. She had been seeing both of them. And so he was shot because his friend was jealous. That actually makes so much more sense.
Yeah, that makes more sense than him having been a robber. I mean...
Well, no, it wasn't even a robbery. That was the thing that was so weird.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah, that makes more sense than him having been the shooter. Like, they were on the right direction when they had 12 people, and they look at him as number 13 and decide he's the one. Like, I often wonder, these cases make me wonder, what did that guy do that, like, they went, he's the guy?
I feel like it was the fact that he had been shot at the hospital.
You think that's the thing that puts him over the top, and they just decide it's him?
And like he didn't elaborate further with regard to his injuries, because like his friend shot him over a girl and he didn't want his friend to get in trouble. And he had no idea it was going to escalate like this.
Yeah.
Because I feel like if it was legitimately a cover story, he would have given more information.
I think you're probably right.
It's actually really sad that it played out the way it did. He was trying to be a stand-up guy, I think. It seems like it was just a series of unfortunate events. The fact that he was the 13th suspect arrested. I mean, can you imagine being murdered and having the police very easily arrest 12 people under suspicion of your murder? I mean, most of the time they can't get one person arrested, right?
Yeah.
Having 12 people considered suspects. It seemed like, and it was Morrison who was the victim, being the police officer. There's no information that there was any sort of run-in. And it was established, it seems like, at least biographically, if not during the trial, that there was no connection between Hill and the victims, right?
Right.
Now, I do think that Hill took it to an extreme that was a little bit unbelievable by saying that, like, he was deeply oppressed and discriminated against just because he was a wobbly.
He's okay. He's the dead guy here, but he's a little bit of a drama queen in his writing.
Well, yeah, and I'm saying I don't think that he absolutely was able to be that way. I just don't think that was the reality.
No, he just chose this hill to die on.
Right, and and it did give him some, like you were saying, he was more famous in death than in life, but I don't see him as any sort of martyr or anything. He did protect his friend, I guess.
How?
And
protect his friend from what, though?
From getting charged with shooting him.
Yeah, I guess.
And I don't know, like, how relevant that was, and I feel like he did not have adequate representation here. I also think that sometimes, not just in like death penalty cases, but in any type of situation, sometimes people don't want to be saved, right?
Yeah.
And it's not like, I mean, he had his share of hardships. And he may have just,
he had just come to the conclusion this was his life.
He accepted his fate. And to me, that's why he made all these crazy statements that because he was part of the IWW, he had no right to live anyway. Because, I mean, that wouldn't be the case. There was nothing about being a member of the IWW that made him less than anybody else. But it did bring a little bit of attention, right?
Yeah.
And I think that was his sort of point in it all. It's a very sad story. And I do feel like that we have this very strong, right to remain silent and defendants don't testify on their own behalf. I do realize that I understand the strategy behind that, but at the same time, I feel like he could have handled the prosecutor's cross-examination here, because if he didn't do it, he would actually be able to answer the questions without fear of implicating himself.
Yeah.
And I feel like it could have been a very bright line and very clear to a jury if he had explained the situation. Not to mention, if they had, they found the information that there were 4 other gunshot wounds treated, did they look into those people? I mean, I'm saying creating reasonable doubt as opposed to trying to establish factual innocence. They could have at least created some reasonable doubt. And I'm still not entirely, to me, the biggest thing was that it's not even completely established that the perpetrator was shot. Isn't that crazy?
Yeah, it is weird. There is further reading on this. The William Adler book, The Man Who Never Died, that one is available. There's also a book by Philip Forner, who's a little bit better known author. He wrote a book called The Case of Joe Hill. He wrote a lot about the American labor movements. You can definitely go down a couple of rabbit holes on those. I think both of those books would be free at some of the local libraries. One of the things I was going to do with this episode, I ended up not doing it because sometimes I genuinely get a hold of something that I don't quite understand. There is this story about Joe Hill becomes a folk hero, basically. And the places that his ashes end up are interesting. One of the envelopes of his ashes allegedly was part of a monument in the Columbine massacre, which not the Columbine massacre that people know, but the Columbine mine massacre of 1927. That's another rabbit hole you can go down if you just want to have some more historical stuff to read. That's a 1927 massacre in Lafayette, and Columbine, Colorado, I believe. It's a lot was going on there between the state police and local militias and essentially coal miners. So there's those three rabbit holes to go down from this case. It is a little bit shorter an episode, but I thought he was an interesting folk hero. The way that his story gets told, nobody really addresses this anymore, whether he did it or not. And I think you and I have, I think my conclusion is, I don't think he did. I don't think he had anything to do with this. He was just wrong place, wrong time, wrong situation.
I don't think he had anything to do with it either. And I have to say that death by firing squad, I feel like, is one of the worst execution methods.
Yeah, I think I have to agree with you on that.
Special consideration was given to True Crime Excess by LabRottiCreations.com. If you have a moment in your favorite app, please go on and give us a review or a 5-star rating. It helps us get noticed in the crowd. This is True Crime XS.
The season twinkles under starry skies, and Kris Kringle's drinking cherry wine. How I wish you were here to stop my Christmas tears. Presents wrapped underneath the tree, hung the stockings up 1, 2, 3. If it could only be you here with me. I love you so, but only Christmas knows. One day it will be my baby and me. Santa's helping stringing up the lights. Winter's wonderland is just outside. How I wish you were here to stop my Christmas tears. Maybe next year we'll be holding hands. I'll be singing, you'll be making plans. If it could only be you here with me. I love you so, but only Christmas knows. One day it will be my baby and me. 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 I love you so, but only Christmas knows. One day it will be my baby and me.
True Crime Excess is brought to you by John and Meg. It's written, produced, edited, and posted by John and Meg. You can always support True Crime Excess through Patreon.com, or if you have a story you'd like them to cover, you can reach them at TrueCrimeAccess.com. Thank you for joining us.
This is just a reminder that we are part of the Zencastr Creator Network. And I've put a link in the show notes if you guys want to check it out for your own podcasting needs. I've always enjoyed using Zencastr. Their quality is great. And we were able to join their Creator Network at kind of a key time in their history. I have enjoyed it. I've considered a lot of other places to record and a lot of other ways to put together and host and distribute our podcast. But I've stuck with Zencastr the longest. We've been with them for hundreds of episodes now. And I'm putting a link in the show notes where you can check out what they have to offer and see if it's something you would want to use.